And again, welcome you, and am delighted to introduce to you as our speaker today, the Reverend Kris Androsky. Kris is the chair of UMEIT USA. So in that capacity, she also serves on the National Planning Committee of the National Workshop on Christian Unity. She is the pastor of Community United Methodist Church in Elm Grove, Wisconsin. She's married. She has a new puppy named Callie, who's sitting there at her feet right now. And the interesting, well, I mean, obviously Kris is an interesting person all around, but one of the things I find interesting about her is her love of Renaissance festivals and that whole world. So anyway, she's a wonderful human being and has a wonderful voice. And Kris, thank you for sharing with us today.
Thanks, Jean. We say pastor by day, pirate by night. So thank you, Jean. So earlier in my career, I served alongside now Bishop Dan Schwerin. And a part of our ministry together was helping an older downtown church turn around from a 30-year decline. And one of the things that Bishop Schwerin would often teach is what we pay attention to grows. We would recite this to one another whenever we received pushback over a slight change we made in worship that made the service more welcoming to newcomers, or every time we faced a struggle in financing a new ministry, or when someone, maybe a longtime member, was upset about something like the little kid who was dancing in front of the pulpit on Sunday mornings. We would say to one another, what we pay attention to grows. If we focus on the struggle, that is all that we will see. If we give more attention to behavior and ideas that limit hospitality, we will feed those ideas. If we devote time and energy and attention to studying scripture, to learning a new spiritual practice, to engaging with community members, those things will grow in importance and value and become a larger part of our reality. It became our belief that this was how we could lead and guide a congregation into thinking of themselves differently and then living differently for the transformation of the church and the world around it. What we pay attention to grows. I think it is a good reminder for us as leaders and community members engaged in ecumenical and interreligious work, because it reminds us that showing up matters. And that's what I really want to talk about this week, this month for our UMEIT Zoom call, that we are all busy. All of us, many of us are probably too busy when it comes to work and home life. And because we have been steeped in a culture that values accomplishments and hard work, that kind of thinking can lead us to worship busyness without even recognizing that we are doing so. Fairly early in my ministry, I recognized that I was pretty good at saying no to things that were not all that important in the grand scheme of life or the grand scheme of church life, but that it was a whole lot more difficult to say no to good things or things that were important, but would just add more into an already full schedule. None of us need, probably most of us don't want more meetings to attend, right? So when we begin to feel busy, it can seem like an easy answer to skip the meetings that don't have clear agendas or specific goals to accomplish. And I don't know about your experience, but my experience has been that it is often the case with local ecumenical and interfaith gatherings, the local monthly ecumenical clergy association or the interfaith practitioners group meetings. It has quite regularly felt as if we would gather, we would share a cup of tea and some treats, we would chat about what was going on in the lives of our faith communities. And then when the hour was over, we would go our separate ways and we would put next month's meeting on our calendar. And so I have been thinking a lot about those kinds of meetings. And one of my mentors wisely taught me that ministry happens at the speed of relationship. And I am fairly sure that he told me that when I was frustrated about some program in the church that wasn't going as well as I had hoped, or I was struggling to find a volunteer for a role that I needed to be filled. But as the years have gone by, I've come to realize that that wisdom applies to a whole lot more than just ministry within a congregation. So in the past few years, that idea that ministry happens at the speed of relationship has hit home for me in some really important ways. And I want to share those with you because there are some ways that are really heartbreaking, but also literally life-saving. So Jean told you a little bit about me. I'm a pastor who lives in the Milwaukee suburb of Waukesha. I have been here for about 15 years, and I've served in a few different roles. I served in that large congregation with Bishop Shireen at the heart of Waukesha's downtown, which is kind of the seat of county government and social service agencies. Then I was serving for a while as the executive director of our homeless shelter system for the county. And then now I serve as pastor of an affluent congregation that's a bit closer to the city of Milwaukee. But when I arrived in Waukesha back in 2007, I was told that there was an ecumenical clergy association that met monthly in town. Reverend Shireen and I were both new. Neither of us ever received an invitation to this group, and we were busy getting to know our congregation, so we didn't really ask many questions about it. It wasn't like we were, looking for another meeting. We had plenty of them. But a few months in, a clergy person in town called and asked me why we hadn't called the meeting together. Like, why have you not called the group together? Apparently, our predecessors were the ones who had hosted the gathering all of the time, and nobody thought to tell us that, or even to host it once themselves and invite us to gather with them to welcome us into town. So once we figured that out, we gathered the clergy of the downtown churches together, and we met to do the typical thing. We talked and we drank coffee. And I remember lamenting with one of my friends as we were walking back to the office after one of those meetings that we had just wasted an hour when our to-do lists were so long. That winter, a man froze to death in his car right behind our church. And we quickly discovered that there were 30 to 35 men in the city who every winter in our neighborhood in Wisconsin were sleeping on the streets because our shelters were full and there was no place for them to go. And all of a sudden, our monthly clergy gatherings where we just drank coffee and talked became a place of powerful lament and a commitment to justice. Because we already knew one another, because we had been learning more about the community through one another, because we had been building relationships and building trust with one another, the news of that death became much more than just a lament for us. We were able to partner together in some really important ways. We recognized there was a need for a winter overflow shelter. And so conversations began with service providers as well as city and county government. And it became really clear that there was nobody else in the community that was looking to identify a location for a shelter or to fund the staffing of that. So one of our churches opened their doors to provide space. The others of us began recruiting volunteers and to staff the shelter. We had no idea what we were doing. It was super clear we had no idea what we were doing. However, it prevented anybody else from dying on the streets that winter. Then we spent the next year raising funds in addition to our church budgets. The county government had identified the cost of a winter shelter to be about $50,000 for the 5 months that are the coldest in the state. So the churches together started meeting, not just clergy, but members of our congregations to talk about how can we raise money to show in good faith that we wanted to partner with the county government. We raised half of that $50,000, and then we asked for a meeting with the county executive. His conference room table was not large enough for us. We filled the room with people sitting, people standing around the group and saying, as a united group, we want to partner with county government so much that we had already raised half of the funds needed. Now, there were probably 1,000 things that we clergy and community members did not agree with one another on. But there was one thing that we did agree on without a doubt, and that was that Christ was calling all of his followers to shelter the homeless. So for the next 10 years, ecumenical and interreligious groups in our community worked with those government officials and the service providers to raise the funds to create makeshift shelters in various locations around the city, to scour zoning maps to figure out a site for the next year, to create new policies and procedures, to engage in letter writing campaigns to the fire chief to ask him to change his interpretation of building codes. And because of that ecumenical work and those relationships built beyond the faith community, no one has frozen on the streets because of a lack of shelter since 2018. Ultimately, a whole new agency was created to oversee that shelter system, and we managed to find a building and to purchase it. Now there is not only shelter when it's needed, but also the ability for other service agencies to be in one place so that those who are vulnerable can go to one place to get not only housing, but case management and disability resources and mental health care and basic medical and dental care. So for all of us in that group, it became a bold witness to the power of God showing up when we were willing to show up and get to know our neighbors, even when there wasn't a pressing need or a clear agenda, because we started to realize that what we pay attention to grows. When I began to serve in my current appointment, the congregation already had lay members that were engaged in our local interfaith network. And I am ashamed to say that initially I fell prey to my own addiction to busyness once again. I would leave those agendaless lunch gatherings thinking about how many emails I could have answered if I had eaten my lunch back at the office, sitting at the computer. You would think I would have learned my lesson the first time around. Clearly, I needed a refresher course once I got to Elm Grove. But the interfaith group was doing some of the things that a lot of interfaith groups do, especially when they are newer groups. The group was holding Thanksgiving services in November with a different faith community hosting us each year, because that was an easy holiday for us to gather around. It's not a religious holiday that excludes any of us. We all believed there was a whole lot of stuff that we could be thankful for together. We would occasionally make a joint statement about something that was happening in the community. We would talk to one another about some of our holiday traditions or foundational beliefs, nothing too controversial, nothing that required a whole lot from us, but we were spending hours together getting to know more about one another as individuals and communities. And then the pandemic hit. And when the pandemic descended on us, within the very first couple of months, we began to hear that there were people accessing the food pantry more than normal. My congregation began hosting drive-through food donations in our parking lot. Other faith communities followed suit. And soon the school district was contacting us because they were hearing from students and families that in our community, one of the most affluent communities in the entire state, students didn't have enough food. The winter was approaching. They knew that many families didn't have winter coats or snow pants or boots or hats for all of the kids that had grown out of their stuff from the year before. Our interfaith communities knew that we didn't have all of the resources that we needed, but we knew that we had some of the resources needed. And we had been practicing relationships for a long time. So when the district superintendent called and asked if I thought that the interfaith group could help find a site to create a new agency to meet the need, I first asked him if he had already talked with the food pantry, because, you know, the food pantry knows how to do this kind of thing. And I remember him laughing and saying, "It seems like I should have thought of that on my own, but this is why we need friends, right?" So our food distribution drive-throughs or collections soon became clothing and food distributions, with people of faith from over 12 different communities staffing that. Protestants and Catholics, Mormons, Muslims, Sikhs, Baha'is, Unitarians, Jews. Everybody were gathering together because it was the core of our faith for all of us. There was a commitment that we could make to feed the hungry, to love our neighbor, to seek mercy. And we had already done the groundwork to know that we could work together in all of it by simply showing up for lunch and paying attention to relationship. So Jean mentioned I live in Waukesha, Wisconsin. I would assume that some of you have heard of Waukesha before, perhaps most recently because of the tragedy that took place at our parade, holiday parade in November of 2021. This is one of the most important and pivotal events that has hit home for me, the importance of doing this work and staying at the table, even when we don't have an agenda. As our community gathered to celebrate the beginning of the busy holiday season in 2021, our downtown streets were filled with families for the parade. Our 3 high schools had marching bands playing. There were dance groups for small kids all the way up through the dancing grannies. We had floats and school groups and sports teams and faith communities with floats and people walking all over in the streets. There were a lot of people gathered together as a community. And that's when a man drove his SUV through the barriers at one end of the parade route, drove through the crowd for several blocks and injured 62 people and killed 6, ranging in age from 8 to 81. It was a devastating event, not just for the hundreds of people who were present, but for our whole community who experienced the trauma of seeing video after video after video of that tragedy unfold. It was traumatic for us to check in on loved ones and friends, to hear story after story of the horrible things that people had heard and seen and experienced. Nobody should ever have to experience that kind of trauma, and nobody is ever prepared for that kind of impact and the aftermath of that. And we know ministry happens at the speed of relationship, and what we pay attention to grows. So within hours, ecumenical and interfaith community members were connecting with one another to talk about what was needed. Because that group had already built trust with one another and with city and government officials as we had worked on the homelessness stuff, it made communication with one another in the midst of crisis a place of refuge and support. The police and the fire departments were running on fumes because they did not get to go home that night. Medical staff were reporting to hospitals even though they weren't scheduled to work because they knew that they were needed. And our school staff were calling all of the kids on families on their rosters to check in. And religious leaders did what we know what to do best, right? We started praying and we started planning a vigil. 24 hours later, somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 people gathered in a city park in below freezing temperatures just so that we could pray together. Over 50,000 people from around the world joined us on live stream during the vigil. Members of various faith traditions spoke. They prayed for those that were injured and lost, those who were grieving, those who ran to help and serve for our community as a whole. We prayed, we sang, we heard from our elected officials, from our police and fire chiefs. Restaurants showed up with hot chocolate and food to keep people warm. We collected thousands of dollars to support victims and families and the agencies that would be doing grief support. We held a blood drive because we knew that there was a blood shortage because of all of the victims showing up at the hospital. It was awful to hear the stories and to see all of that grief. And it felt like an act of faithful defiance to show up in a crowd that was larger than the one that had been traumatized by their presence at the parade the night before. Ministry happens at the speed of relationship, and it happens because of relationship. And I know that these stories are not unique to my experience or to my community. I am sure that every one of you have story upon story that you could tell about how the slow and faithful work of building ecumenical and interfaith faith relationships has made an impact. So my purpose today isn't to convince you of anything or to even teach you of the importance of this work because you already know it. But my hope is that this will be a reminder for all of us, maybe a gentle prod to reach out and to make a new connection in your community, to show up and to do the sometimes mundane and seemingly directionless work of getting to know one another. Because staying at the table is critically important, even when the only agenda item is relationships. So mostly I want to say thank you for the work that you are already doing, for your commitment to this kind of faithful ministry of relationship building across the boundaries of our denominations and our religions, because I truly believe that this is how the work of unity begins. And I pray that as we pay attention to it, it will grow.